The maneuver that saved the fleet. How the US Navy dodges torpedoes. Somewhere beneath the waves, a torpedo is running hot, straight and normal, closing on a warship at over 40 knots. On the bridge, an officer has less than 60 seconds to make a decision that will decide whether his ship and everyone on it goes home. He doesn't turn away. He doesn't run. Instead, he does something that looks, to the untrained eye, almost suicidal. He turns the ship toward the torpedo's line of approach, shrinking his own silhouette down to almost nothing, and lets the weapon slide past the hull with feet to spare. This isn't a scene from a movie. It's a real tactic, refined over a century of undersea warfare, and it's still taught in the US Navy today. Some call it combing the tracks. Online, it's picked up a flashier nickname, the drift. The art of turning into danger to make yourself impossible to hit. There's no maneuver literally called that in any Navy manual, but the tactic behind the nickname is very real, and it's saved ships and lives more than once. To understand why this maneuver exists, you have to understand what a torpedo is actually aiming at. A torpedo doesn't fire at where a ship is. It fires at where a ship is going to be. A submarine commander, or a fire control computer, calculates a firing solution. Target speed, target course, target range, and sends the torpedo down that predicted track. If the ship holds its course and speed, the torpedo arrives exactly where the ship will be in 60 or 90 seconds. Simple geometry, deadly geometry. But warships aren't just sitting ducks. They're also, from certain angles, remarkably small ducks. A destroyer broadside on might present a target several hundred feet long. Turn that same destroyer bow on or stern on to the incoming threat, and suddenly the target profile shrinks down to the width of the hull, often less than 40 feet. A torpedo aimed at a 300-foot broadside has a much easier job than one aimed at a 40-foot bow. This is the foundation of the whole technique. It isn't about outrunning a weapon that can move over 40 knots underwater. Most surface ships can't win that straight-line race. It's about outthinking the shot, turning the geometry of the engagement against the weapon itself. The tactic has a real name in naval doctrine: combing the wake or combing the tracks. Here's how it plays out. A torpedo, or a spread of torpedoes, is detected, visually, by a wake trail on the surface, by sonar, or by a lookout who's just spotted the telltale line of bubbles. The officer of the deck has to make an immediate call. Which way is the weapon traveling, and how many are there? If it's a single torpedo approaching from an angle, turning hard into the direction the torpedo came from rather than away from it, does two things. First, it minimizes the target's exposed length, the way turning a book edge on makes it nearly invisible from the front. Second, and just as important, it buys time. Because the ship is now moving roughly parallel to the torpedo's path rather than across it, the weapon has to travel farther to catch up rather than simply intercepting a slow-moving broadside. Turning away from a fast torpedo often just delays the inevitable. You're still presenting a wide target while the weapon eats up the range. Turning into the track, cutting the odds down to something like threading a needle, is the more survivable bet. It sounds counterintuitive. Every instinct says, flee. The Navy's answer, hammered into officers through decades of training and tactical publications, is, don't flee, narrow. It gets more complicated with spreads of multiple torpedoes fired in a fan pattern, which was standard submarine practice for exactly this reason, to defeat a single evasive turn. In that case, there often isn't a clean answer. Officers are trained to comb through the gaps between individual torpedo tracks rather than trying to escape the spread entirely, essentially threading the ship between weapons that are, by design, spaced apart to cover more water. Combing the tracks is what you do once a torpedo is already in the water. But the Navy learned, at enormous cost, that the better fight is the one you win before a torpedo is ever fired. That's where zigzagging comes in. During the World Wars, US and Allied ships crossing submarine-infested waters didn't sail in straight lines. They followed prearranged zigzag plans, sequences of course changes at set intervals, spelled out on printed diagrams and timed with a specialized device called a zigzag clock, which would ring at intervals to signal the next turn. The intent wasn't primarily to dodge torpedoes already fired, although it helped with that too. It was to deny an enemy submarine the stable bearing and speed data it needed to build an accurate firing solution in the first place. A U-boat captain tracking a ship on a steady course could calculate a shot with confidence. A ship constantly altering course forced him to constantly recalculate, shrinking his window to fire and increasing the odds his shot would go wide. Naval analysts during the war actually studied this rigorously, running the numbers on how much zigzagging really improved a ship's survival odds against how much it slowed the convoy down and extended its time in dangerous waters. The consensus that emerged was that the protection zigzagging offered against a submarine gaining a firing position in the first place generally outweighed the cost of the extra time it took to reach port. By the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, this had become standard doctrine across the fleet. When in waters where submarines might be present, ships zigzagged as a matter of course, not just as a reaction to a spotted threat. For decades, this system worked because torpedoes, for all their menace, were relatively simple. Straight running, sometimes pattern running, weaving back and forth to increase the odds of hitting something in a convoy. But still, fundamentally, dumb. Then came homing torpedoes, and later, wake homing torpedoes. A genuinely nasty piece of engineering that changed the entire calculation. A wake homing torpedo doesn't aim at the ship at all. It aims at the ship's wake. The trail of turbulence and bubbles, a vessel's propellers churn up behind it. Once it locks onto that wake, it follows it forward, zigzagging along the edges of the turbulent water like a bloodhound on a scent trail, until it reaches the stern of the ship, the single most vulnerable point on any vessel: propellers, rudders, steering gear. Here's the unsettling part. A ship literally cannot outmaneuver a wake-homing torpedo through course changes alone. Wherever the ship goes, it drags its own wake behind it, and the torpedo simply keeps following that trail. Combing the tracks doesn't work against a weapon that isn't aimed at your hull in the first place. It's aimed at the disturbance you leave in the water, no matter which way you turn. This forced the Navy to develop an entirely different layer of defense: decoys and hard-kill countermeasures. Systems like the towed acoustic decoy, known as Nixie, generate noise and turbulence louder than the ship's own propellers, luring the torpedo away to chase a false target instead of the real hull. Research labs, including the Applied Research Laboratory at Penn State, spent years developing anti-torpedo. Torpedoes, essentially smaller torpedoes, fired specifically to intercept and destroy an incoming enemy torpedo before it can reach the ship. A genuine fire-and-forget hard-kill weapon designed to hunt down the sonar wake homer itself. None of this replaced the old maneuvering doctrine. It supplemented it. Modern surface ship torpedo defense today is described as a layered system. Detect the threat as early as possible. Maneuver to reduce target exposure where that still helps. Deploy decoys to defeat homing sensors, and, as a last resort, use hard-kill interceptors against torpedoes that decoys and maneuvering alone can't stop. It would be easy to assume that in an age of satellite targeting, hypersonic missiles, and AI-assisted fire control, a century-old ship-handling trick is obsolete. It isn't. Naval analysts have been blunt about this in recent years. Reactive maneuvering against torpedoes is threat-specific and brutally time-critical. Execute the wrong maneuver, evading as if it's a straight-running torpedo when it's actually a wake homer, and the ship can be hit anyway. Execute the right maneuver too early or too late, and the result is the same. This is precisely why every officer of the deck still drills combing the tracks doctrine, as though the fleet was still fighting through the Atlantic or the Pacific in the 1940s. Ships without sonar of their own, carriers, logistics ships, amphibious vessels, remain especially exposed, since they often rely entirely on escorts to detect a threat before it's already in the water. That vulnerability hasn't gone away with modern technology. If anything, the increasing sophistication of torpedo guidance has made the human judgment call at the center of the maneuver even more important, not less. There's no single official maneuver called the drift in any US Navy manual. What exists instead is a body of hard-won tactical wisdom, combing the tracks to shrink the target, zigzagging to deny the shot before it's ever taken, decoys to defeat the smartest host, Ming torpedoes, and when all else fails, a torpedo of your own fired back at the one hunting you. It isn't magic, and it isn't guaranteed. It's geometry, timing, and nerve. A bridge officer, in the space of a few seconds, doing the math that turns a warship from an easy target into a needle threading its way through the eye of its own destruction. That's not a Hollywood trick. That's what the US Navy actually trains its people to do,